What happens when one of Hollywood's most laid-back actors completely loses his cool on live television? Matthew McConaughey, known for his calm demeanor and philosophical approach to life, found himself in the most explosive interview of his career when he sat down with Hoda Kotb on The Today Show. The tension started building from the very first question, and by the end, viewers witnessed something nobody expected to see from the usually zen actor. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets more intense with every passing minute. It started as what seemed like a routine promotional interview. Matthew McConaughey had just released his latest memoir, and the Today Show producers thought it would be perfect for their morning slot. Hoda Kotb, seasoned in handling celebrity interviews, prepared her usual mix of personal questions and career highlights. Neither she nor anyone in the studio could have predicted what was about to unfold. The interview began cordially enough. Hoda welcomed Matthew with her characteristic warmth, mentioning his new book and his recent projects. Matthew responded with his typical drawl, seemingly relaxed in the studio chair. But there was something different about his energy that morning, a subtle tension that only became apparent as the conversation progressed. "Matthew, your book talks a lot about authenticity and staying true to yourself," Hoda began, her voice carrying that professional yet friendly tone she was known for. "But some critics have said that your whole persona, the philosophical Matthew, the guy who talks about life lessons, might just be another Hollywood act. How do you respond to that?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Matthew's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening just slightly. This wasn't the softball question he had expected. "Well, Hoda," he said, his voice maintaining its usual cadence but with an edge that hadn't been there moments before, "I think when people don't understand authenticity, they assume it must be an act. That says more about them than it does about me." Hoda leaned forward slightly, sensing she had touched on something significant. "But surely you can understand why some people might be skeptical. You've cultivated this very specific image, this almost guru-like presence. Isn't it fair for people to question whether that's the real Matthew McConaughey or just good marketing?" "Good marketing?" Matthew repeated, his southern accent becoming more pronounced as his voice took on a sharper tone. "Hoda, I've been talking about these same principles, living by these same values, since before I was famous. This isn't some character I put on for the cameras. This is who I am, and frankly, I'm surprised that someone in your position would suggest otherwise." The studio audience, initially buzzing with the usual energy of a live taping, began to quiet down. Something was shifting in the dynamic between host and guest, and everyone could feel it. Hoda, to her credit, didn't back down. Her journalistic instincts were kicking in, and she could sense there was more to explore here. "I'm not suggesting anything, Matthew. I'm asking questions that I think our viewers want answers to. When you talk about living authentically, but you're also part of an industry that's built on creating personas and selling images, can you really blame people for wondering where Matthew the person ends and Matthew the brand begins?" Matthew's hands, which had been resting casually on his knees, now gripped them more tightly. His usual relaxed posture was becoming more rigid. "You know what, Hoda? I came here to talk about my book, to share some insights that might help people in their own lives. I didn't come here to have my entire identity questioned by someone who's never walked in my shoes." "But that's exactly what makes for good television, isn't it?" Hoda pressed on, her voice remaining professional but with a hint of challenge. "The willingness to dig deeper, to ask the questions that get beyond the surface. If you're as authentic as you claim to be, shouldn't you be comfortable with that level of scrutiny?" The word "claim" hit Matthew like a verbal slap. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time in the interview, his composure began to crack. "Claim? Did you just say claim?" "Hoda, I don't claim to be anything. I am what I am, and I've been consistent about that for decades. The fact that you're sitting there questioning my authenticity, while you're playing some kind of gotcha journalism game, tells me everything I need to know about where this conversation is headed." Hoda could sense she was walking into dangerous territory, but something about Matthew's reaction told her she was on to something significant. The polished interview was becoming something much more raw and real. Matthew, I think you're misunderstanding my role here. I'm not playing games. I'm doing my job, which is to ask questions that our audience wants answered. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe we should talk about why. Uncomfortable? Matthew's voice was rising now, though he was still trying to maintain some semblance of control. Hoda, I've done thousands of interviews. I've sat with journalists who've tried to tear me apart, and I've always maintained my composure. But there's something about this line of questioning that feels different. It feels personal, and frankly, it feels unfair. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Camera operators were adjusting their angles, sensing that something significant was happening. The producer in the control room was watching intently, knowing they were capturing something that would likely make headlines. Hoda, despite the growing intensity, continued to push forward. Personal? Matthew, these are professional questions about your public image. If asking about the difference between your private self and your public persona feels personal to you, then maybe that's something worth exploring. Why does that question bother you so much? Matthew's composure was slipping further with each exchange. The philosophical, measured man that audiences knew was being replaced by someone more raw, more defensive. It bothers me because you're implying that I'm somehow fake, that everything I've built my life around is just an elaborate performance. Do you have any idea what it's like to live your life trying to help people, trying to be genuine, only to have someone like you suggest that it's all just an act? Someone like me? Hoda's eyebrows raised, and her tone shifted from professional inquiry to something more pointed. Matthew, what exactly do you mean by that? Because I'm a journalist doing my job? Or because I'm asking questions you don't want to answer? Matthew realized he had stepped into deeper waters, but instead of pulling back, he seemed determined to wade in further. What I mean, Hoda, is that you're sitting there in your comfortable studio chair, making judgments about my life and my character based on what? A few movie roles and some interviews? You've never lived through what I've lived through. You've never had to maintain your sense of self, while an entire industry tries to reshape you into whatever they think will sell tickets. But Matthew, Hoda interjected, her voice gaining strength, that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. If the industry pressure is so intense, how can you be so certain that you haven't been influenced by it? How can you be so sure that the Matthew McConaughey we see today isn't at least partially a product of that system? The question hit its mark. Matthew's face flushed slightly and his hands moved from his knees to grip the arms of his chair. Because I know who I am, Hoda. I know what I believe in. I know what matters to me. And I know the difference between adapting to an industry and selling your soul to it. What you're suggesting is that I've somehow lost myself along the way. And that's not just wrong, it's insulting. Hoda leaned back slightly, but her gaze never wavered from Matthew's increasingly agitated face. I'm not trying to insult you, Matthew, but I am trying to understand how someone can be so confident about their authenticity when they're operating in an environment that rewards performance over truth. Your entire career has been built on convincing people that you're someone else, movie after movie. How do you separate the performer from the person? You want to know how I separate them? Matthew's voice was getting louder now, his usual measured delivery giving way to something more urgent and raw. I'll tell you how. When I go home at night, when the cameras stop rolling, when the interviews are over, I'm still the same guy who grew up in Texas, who learned about life from his parents, who believes in treating people with respect and living with integrity. That doesn't change based on what role I'm playing or what interview I'm giving. But Matthew, Hoda pressed on, clearly sensing that she was getting closer to something significant. Can you honestly say that fame hasn't changed you at all? That the success, the money, the constant attention hasn't influenced who you are or how you see yourself? Because if you can say that with complete certainty, then you might be the first person in Hollywood history to be completely immune to those pressures. Matthew's jaw clenched visibly. The philosophical demeanor that had made him famous was cracking under the pressure of Hoda's relentless questioning. Of course fame changes you, Hoda. I've never denied that. But there's a difference between growth and fundamental change, between evolution and compromise. What you're suggesting is that everything I am is somehow false, that my entire identity is just a carefully crafted image. And that, frankly, is ridiculous. I'm not suggesting your entire identity is false, Hoda replied, her tone becoming more assertive. But I am suggesting that the version of yourself you present to the world might be more curated than you're willing to admit. And there's nothing wrong with that, Matthew. Everyone does it to some degree. What I find interesting is how defensive you're getting about the suggestion. Defensive? Matthew's voice rose sharply, causing several people in the studio to look up from their work. I'm not being defensive, Hoda. I'm being honest. And the fact that you're interpreting honesty as defensiveness tells me that you're more interested in creating drama than you are in having a real conversation. Hoda's expression hardened slightly. Creating drama? Matthew, I'm doing exactly what journalists are supposed to do. I'm asking follow-up questions. I'm digging deeper when answers feel incomplete. If that feels like drama to you, then maybe you're not as comfortable with authentic conversation as you claim to be. The word claim appeared again, and this time Matthew's reaction was immediate and intense. He shifted forward in his chair, his body language becoming more aggressive. There's that word again, Hoda. Claim. You keep using it like everything I say is somehow suspect, like I'm making assertions that need to be proven rather than sharing my own experience of my own life. Who exactly gave you the authority to determine what's authentic about me and what isn't? The same authority that every journalist has, Hoda shot back, her professional composure beginning to show signs of strain. The authority to ask questions, to seek truth, to challenge statements that seem inconsistent or incomplete. If you're uncomfortable with that level of scrutiny, then maybe doing interviews isn't the right choice for you. Uncomfortable with scrutiny? Matthew's voice was now loud enough that the entire studio could hear every word clearly. Hoda, I've been scrutinized by everyone from gossip columnists to serious film critics for over 2 decades. I've had my personal life dissected, my career choices questioned, my relationships analyzed. But what you're doing isn't scrutiny. It's something else entirely. You're not seeking truth. You're trying to create doubt about something that doesn't need to be doubted. Hoda was fully engaged now, her journalist instincts in overdrive. And what exactly am I trying to create doubt about, Matthew? Your authenticity? Your sincerity? Because if those things are as solid as you say they are, then a few probing questions shouldn't be able to shake them. You're trying to create doubt about my entire identity. Matthew's voice boomed across the studio, causing several crew members to stop what they were doing and stare. You're sitting there suggesting that everything I've worked to build, everything I've tried to represent, might just be an elaborate performance. And you're doing it under the guise of journalism, as if tearing someone down is the same thing as seeking truth. The studio had gone completely quiet now. Even the usual background noise of a live television production had stopped, as everyone focused on the increasingly heated exchange between host and guest. Hoda, despite the intensity of Matthew's outburst, maintained her composure, but there was a steely determination in her voice that hadn't been there at the beginning of the interview. Matthew, if asking you to explain the difference between your public and private self feels like tearing you down, then maybe that's a question you need to ask yourself, not me. I'm not trying to destroy anything you've built. I'm trying to understand it, and more importantly, I'm trying to help our viewers understand it. If that process is uncomfortable for you, then perhaps you should consider why. Matthew's hands were now gripping the chair arms so tightly that his knuckles were white. His face was flushed, and his breathing had become noticeably heavier. Uncomfortable? Hoda, what's uncomfortable is sitting here listening to you question my fundamental character while pretending it's just good journalism. What's uncomfortable is realizing that you invited me here not to discuss my book or my work, but to try to expose some kind of contradiction that exists only in your imagination. A contradiction that exists only in my imagination? Hoda's voice took on a sharper edge, her professional mask finally beginning to slip. Matthew, I've interviewed hundreds of celebrities over the years, and I've learned to recognize when someone is being evasive. You're not answering my questions, you're deflecting them. You're attacking my methods instead of addressing my concerns. If there's no contradiction to explore, then why are you so afraid to explore it? Matthew shot up from his chair so quickly that it rolled backward several feet. The sudden movement caused a collective gasp from the studio audience and crew. He stood there for a moment, towering over the seated Hoda, his chest heaving with barely controlled anger. Afraid? Did you just say I'm afraid? Hoda, I've spent my entire adult life facing fears, confronting challenges, pushing myself into uncomfortable situations. I'm not afraid of your questions. I'm disgusted by your approach. Hoda remained seated, but her posture straightened, and her voice took on a tone of steel. Then sit down and answer them, Matthew. If you're not afraid, if you're as authentic as you claim to be, then prove it. Show our viewers who Matthew McConaughey really is when he's pushed outside his comfort zone. This isn't about being pushed outside my comfort zone. Matthew's voice echoed through the studio as he gestured wildly with his hands. This is about basic respect. This is about the difference between journalism and interrogation. You've turned what should have been a conversation about my book into some kind of trial, where I'm apparently guilty until proven innocent. The control room was in chaos. Producers were frantically communicating through headsets, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let the confrontation continue. The ratings were undoubtedly spiking, but this was uncharted territory for morning television. Hoda, meanwhile, seemed energized by the confrontation, rather than intimidated by it. "A trial?" she asked, her voice rising to match his volume. "Matthew, you're the one who's acting like you're on trial. I asked you some basic questions about authenticity in Hollywood, and you've turned it into this dramatic performance. If this is how you react when someone simply asks you to explain yourself, then maybe the questions about your authenticity are more valid than I initially thought." Matthew began pacing behind his chair, his hands running through his hair in obvious frustration. "Performance? You think this is a performance? Hoda, this is what happens when someone pushes another human being too far. This is what happens when you cross the line from professional inquiry into personal attack. You want to see the real Matthew McConaughey? Well, congratulations, because this is him. This is what I look like when someone tries to tear down everything I've worked to build." "And what exactly have you worked to build, Matthew?" Hoda shot back, now standing herself to match his energy. "Because from where I'm sitting, what you've built is an image of yourself as this zen, philosophical figure who's above the pettiness of Hollywood. But the moment someone questions that image, you fall apart. You're screaming at me on live television because I asked you to defend your authenticity. How is that the behavior of someone who's as grounded and self-aware as you claim to be?" "I'm not falling apart," Matthew roared, his face now red with anger. "I'm responding to an attack. There's a difference between defending yourself and falling apart, and the fact that you can't see that difference tells me everything I need to know about your perspective on this conversation." The studio audience was completely silent now, watching in stunned fascination as one of Hollywood's most controlled actors completely lost his composure on live television. Hoda, feeding off the energy and intensity of the moment, pressed her advantage. "An attack? Matthew, I asked you about the difference between your public and private persona. That's not an attack. That's a standard interview question. The fact that you've interpreted it as an attack, the fact that you're standing there yelling at me, suggests that maybe there's more truth to the question than you're comfortable admitting." Matthew stopped pacing and turned to face her directly, his eyes blazing with fury. "You want to know the difference between my public and private persona, Hoda? Here's the difference. In private, I don't have to sit here and listen to some morning show host question my fundamental character. In private, I don't have to explain to anyone why I am the way I am or justify my approach to life. In private, I can be myself without having someone like you suggest that it's all just an elaborate act." "Someone like me?" Hoda repeated, her voice dangerous now. "What exactly do you mean by that, Matthew? Because you've said it twice now, and I'm starting to wonder if there's something specific about me that bothers you beyond just my questions." Matthew paused, realizing he had stepped into even more dangerous territory. But instead of backing down, his anger seemed to fuel him forward. "What bothers me about you, Hoda, is that you've taken what should have been a respectful conversation and turned it into an ambush. What bothers me is that you're hiding behind the label of journalism to justify behavior that's nothing more than professional harassment. What bothers me is that you seem to think that because you have a television show, You have the right to tear down anyone who sits in that chair. Professional harassment? Hoda's voice rose to a near shout. Matthew, I asked you to explain your authenticity. That's my job. If explaining your authenticity feels like harassment to you, then maybe the problem isn't with my questions. It's with your answers. Maybe the reason you can't handle these questions is because deep down, you know there's some truth to what I'm asking. The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. His face went from red to pale in an instant, and for a moment he stood there in stunned silence. Then, slowly, his expression changed from anger to something much more dangerous, something cold and controlled. Deep down? He said, his voice now quiet but filled with menace. You think you know what I know deep down? Hoda, you don't know me at all. You don't know my struggles, my journey, my values, or my character. You've spent 30 minutes with me, and you think you can psychoanalyze my entire existence? You think you can determine what's real about me and what isn't based on how I react to your inappropriate questions? Hoda, perhaps sensing that she had pushed too far, tried to moderate her tone slightly. Matthew, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze you. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about authenticity in Hollywood, and you're the one who's made it personal. I made it personal? Matthew's voice was building again, the brief moment of cold control giving way to renewed fury. Hoda, you made it personal the moment you suggested that my entire identity might be fake. You made it personal when you questioned whether the man I've spent 50 years becoming is just some kind of marketing strategy. You don't get to attack someone's fundamental character and then act surprised when they take it personally. Matthew, please sit down, Hoda said, her voice now carrying a note of concern as she gestured toward his chair. Let's try to have a civil conversation about this. Civil? Matthew's laugh was harsh and bitter, completely devoid of his usual warmth. You want to talk about civil now? After you've spent the last half hour systematically attacking everything I stand for? After you've questioned my authenticity, my character, my entire life's work? Now you want civil? The tension in the studio was so thick it felt suffocating. Crew members were frozen in place, unsure whether they should intervene or continue filming what was clearly becoming television history. The control room was in complete pandemonium, with executives trying to decide whether to pull the plug on what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. Hoda took a deep breath, seemingly trying to regain control of the situation. Matthew, I think we both need to step back here. This conversation has gotten more heated than either of us intended, and maybe we should— Don't! Matthew cut her off, his voice booming across the studio with such force that several people visibly flinched. Don't you dare try to backtrack now! Don't you dare try to play the reasonable one after you've pushed me to this point. You wanted to see who I really am, Hoda? You wanted to strip away the so-called performance and get to the real Matthew McConaughey? Well, congratulations. This is him! This is what happens when you take a man who spent his entire career trying to be respectful, trying to be thoughtful, trying to be genuine, and you attack the very foundation of who he is. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and for a moment something vulnerable flickered across his face before being consumed again by rage. You know what the real tragedy is here, Hoda? It's that I came here genuinely excited to share something meaningful with your audience. I came here hoping to have a real conversation about life, about growth, about the things that actually matter. And instead, you've turned it into this circus, this spectacle where my entire identity becomes fodder for your ratings. Matthew, that's not what Hoda began, but he wasn't finished. No, you've had your turn to talk. You've had your chance to ask your probing questions and make your accusations. Now it's my turn. Matthew's hands were shaking now. Whether from anger or adrenaline, it was impossible to tell. You want to know about authenticity, Hoda? Real authenticity isn't about never changing or never being influenced by your environment. Real authenticity is about staying true to your core values while you grow and evolve. It's about maintaining your integrity even when the world around you is trying to compromise it. It's about being willing to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, to be human. His voice rose to a crescendo that filled every corner of the studio. And you know what else real authenticity is about, Hoda? It's about being willing to stand up for yourself when someone tries to tear you down. It's about refusing to let others define who you are based on their limited understanding of your life. It's about having the courage to show your anger, your frustration, your humanity, even when it's not pretty or polished or media-friendly. The studio was dead silent except for Matthew's heavy breathing. Hoda stood frozen, clearly overwhelmed by the intensity of his outburst. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Then Matthew's voice dropped to just above a whisper, but the intensity remained. "You asked me earlier how I separate the performer from the person. Well, here's your answer. The performer would have sat there and taken your questions with a smile. The performer would have given you sanitized, media-trained responses that revealed nothing real about who I am. The performer would have protected his image at all costs." He paused, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that was almost frightening. "But the person, the real Matthew McConaughey, is standing here telling you that your questions were inappropriate. Your approach was disrespectful. And your assumption that everything genuine must be performance is not only wrong, it's insulting to everyone who's ever tried to live an authentic life in an inauthentic world." Hoda finally found her voice, though it was noticeably shakier than it had been throughout the interview. "Matthew, I never intended to—" "Intended?" Matthew interrupted again, his voice sharp as a blade. "Hoda, intent doesn't matter when the impact is this destructive. You may not have intended to attack my character, but that's exactly what you did. You may not have intended to question my fundamental identity, but that's what happened. And you know what? Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Maybe this is what authentic television actually looks like, instead of the polished, predictable conversations that usually happen in these chairs." He began walking toward the edge of the set, then turned back to face both Hoda and the cameras. "You want to know who Matthew McConaughey really is? He's someone who believes in treating people with respect until they prove they don't deserve it. He's someone who values genuine conversation over manufactured controversy. He's someone who's spent decades trying to use his platform to inspire and uplift others, only to find himself sitting across from someone who seems more interested in tearing him down than building anything meaningful." His voice began to rise again, the brief moment of quiet intensity giving way to renewed fury. "But most importantly, he's someone who won't sit quietly while his life's work, his values, and his character are dismissed as nothing more than clever marketing. He's someone who believes that authenticity matters, that integrity matters, that treating people with dignity matters, even when they don't extend the same courtesy to you." Matthew turned toward the cameras, addressing the audience directly for the first time. "If you're watching this at home, I want you to understand something. This isn't what I wanted this interview to be. This isn't the conversation I came here to have. But sometimes, real life breaks through the carefully constructed walls of television, and you get to see something genuine, something unfiltered, something authentic." He looked back at Hoda, his expression a mixture of anger, disappointment, and exhaustion. "And that, Hoda, is the difference between the performer and the person. The performer would have given you what you expected. The person gave you what was real." With that, Matthew walked off the set, leaving Hoda standing alone, the studio in stunned silence, and millions of viewers witnessing one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. The cameras continued rolling as Hoda struggled to find words to address the audience, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what had just transpired. The interview that was supposed to promote a book about authentic living had become the ultimate demonstration of what happens when authenticity collides with the manufactured world of television. Matthew McConaughey had indeed erupted, but in doing so he had revealed something raw and real that television audiences rarely get to see. What did you think about Matthew's explosive reaction? Was Hoda's line of questioning justified, or did she push too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more celebrity stories that reveal what really happens when the cameras are rolling.